Good evening, everyone. I'm going to take that notice of the meeting being recorded as my cue to start. Welcome, everyone. This is my first event back after a long summer, and I'm delighted that this is the event we're beginning, well, sort of my year with. Welcome to Manchester Poetry Library, albeit virtually. We are a few technical things tonight. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Zoom by now, but probably the best thing to watch this on tonight is the speaker view function. If you look at the top right of your screen, you'll see view, and it will allow you to choose between view and gallery. Between speaker view and gallery, and a speaker would be the ideal one. The event is being recorded, and it should only pick up the speaker. So if you keep your cameras and your mics off, then that should work fine. Manchester Poetry Library is based on Manchester's Oxford Road at Manchester Metropolitan University. We are a library that's open to the public. We are a collection of mostly 21st, 20th and late 19th century poetry, some particular focuses around poetry and recording, poetry for children, and also poetry in the languages spoken in Manchester. We've taken quite a careful approach to this. We are, in that we've invited poets to help us curate lists in different languages, and these have included to date Jennifer Lee Tsai has helped us with our Chinese poetry collection, and Bogdan Piasecki helped us with our Polish, and each of those also had an event which celebrated the collection and the list that they created. And our poet who's been curating our Arabic language poetry with us is Ali Al-Jamri, who's a Bahraini poet and translator based in the UK. He's recently edited Between Two Islands in 2021, an anthology of Bahraini diaspora poetry. And he's appeared in anthologies and magazines, including Modern Poetry and Translation, and much more. Ali's list, like these lists that we're creating for the collection, are not exhaustive. They're not complete, but then no library should ever be complete. They constantly need to grow, and often these lists can be very personal. The books Ali's recommended to us through his research are currently under order, and they'll be processed and available at the library soon. But the conversation around it has continued, first between me and Ali, and then the conversation I guess he's had with himself, and I guess I'll speak to that a little bit, but then also with Huda, who's joining us from the US today. Huda Fakhreddine is a writer, translator, editor, and associate professor of Arabic literature at the University of Pennsylvania. And her translations of modern Arabic poems have appeared in Banipal, World Literature Today, and Middle Eastern Literatures. And her translation, Come Take a Gentle Stab, by Salim Barakat, is forthcoming this September. And I'm lucky enough to have sat in on the conversations between Huda and Ali as we prepared for this event, and I'm really excited for you to share in these today. And that reminds me, one thing I wanted to say about these lists is that one of the ideas behind creating these is also to encourage other people to share what they think should be there. A library, as much as you can have a lot of books in a library, there's always something missing, and we're here to hear what that is. So please do use the chat, make your recommendations. We will look at it, and that's how the collection grows, is through recommendation like this. This is the last note I'm going to end on. The other day, Ali referred to me as a translation nerd, and I said I really enjoyed being called that. And Huda said, you should, it's an honor. And I think she's completely right. And that's my honor in turn to introduce Ali and Huda. And I really hope you enjoy the event tonight.
Hi, Martin. Thanks for the very nice introduction. Should I start by giving a bit of an intro about some of the selection and my thoughts about it, and kind of what we're doing here tonight? Is that right, Martin?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So when I was invited by Martin to curate this list of poetry for, just unmuting Huda as well. I think there was a technical issue.
Thank you.
Hi, Huda.
Hey.
So when I was first asked by Martin to curate this list of Arabic poetry, my first thought was, am I the right person to do it? Because I grew up in I've spent most of my life living in the West, lived in Bahrain as a child, but also spent all of my adult life here in the UK, and half of my childhood in the UK as well. So there's always a feeling of an imposter syndrome as someone who grows up detached from their culture. And actually Martin kind of soothed me and said, well, put together your personal canon, the things that move you personally is what you should be putting in. And that, I think, has been the nicest part of this thing that we're sharing today, because it is very much a personal canon, but I hope that in sharing it, that it inspires others and that people can also reflect on their personal canons. So in my canon, which is around about 50, I think I chose 50 to 60 books, pamphlets, diwans to put in. And I started with the obvious names. Al-Mutanabbi is right at the top of the list. Mahmoud Darwish was right at the top of the list. Samih al-Qasim. And then I started moving down. And I thought, well, I love my Bahraini culture. What are the Bahraini ones that I put? So Muhammad Ali al-Nasri is there. Mullah Atiyah al-Jamri is there. People who you wouldn't see outside of a Bahraini or Khaliji list are there. Ibrahim al-Arayd is on that list. Qasim Haddad, who you probably would see on other lists, is there as well. I realized that quite a lot of my list included a lot of Iraqi poets. Badr Shakir, al-Sayyab, Amil al-Jaburi, Fawzi Karim. These names which all spoke to me because I also understood where they were writing from very implicitly. And I realized that I actually understand Iraqi poetry very well, in a sense that I immediately click with it. And as I was putting it together, I started realizing how many are the poets of past generation, how many are poets of contemporary generation, and how many poets are from remote regions of the Arab world, remote in relation to me and which are in localities very familiar to me. So I found myself realizing that I could place them in 4 boxes, and the boxes I call are ancestors, parents, peers, and locality. So the ancestors are the Mutanabbis, the Ibn al-Muqarrids, these the Mu'allaqat, these titans who shape Arabic. The parents, I say, is this 20th century poetry, the radical reformers of poetry like Nazik, al-Malaika, and Adonis, and so forth, who shaped and spoke for my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation. Then there are the peers, the people who are writing today, people like Asmaa, Azaizeh, who will be reading one of her poems today. And then there's the local. I realized I needed, as much as I could read Arabic poetry, when I read something that is from a locality that I can picture it, that is in Bahrain. And if I were a Tunisian, I would feel the same about poetry from Tunis. I'm Bahraini, so when I read that, I realized this is my sense of belonging. And I realized I was reading, trying to find a sense of belonging. And there's no one route to belonging. So that belonging came from a variety of these sources. So it was a real pleasure to put this together and then to hopefully share this with the world and share this with you today. And Huda very kindly has helped me make sense of this, because where I've come from a very personal background of not having learned Arabic in school, not having studied Arabic poetry in a scholastic environment, putting it together out of pure passion for my sense of self, needing to identify my sense of self. But has been amazing in showing me where the connections are with the wider and with the greater than, and with the canons, with the how these poems also sing to one another. So I think I'm going to pause there and pass over to you, Huda.
Well, that's a great, yeah, that's a lot you're handing over to me, but thank you, Ali. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Martin, for the wonderful conversations and for this lovely gathering. I would like to go back to where Ali asked himself, am I the right person to do this, when asked to curate a selection from all of the Arabic poetic tradition. That's a very responsible response. It's a very responsible, reasonable reaction. Because as we've mentioned in our conversations, selections are a very unrepresentative thing. I am hyper allergic to selections, especially when they claim to do more than a selection can do. And I'm hoping that the 10 poems and the 10 texts we've chosen to read today will only stand for the vast wealth that is missing. And as Ali said, it is very much a personal selection. We selected poets we like. It doesn't mean that the poets we didn't select we don't like, but this is, there is an element of randomness to how you select. And I'm also very sensitive to the fact that literary traditions like Arabic, thought of as minor or other on the stage of world literature, are often asked to do this, to make a case for themselves in a nutshell, in an hour. I worry when that happens. I wouldn't have worried so much had we been doing this to French poetry or to English poetry. And that's why it's good to always remind ourselves that this is not representative. As Martin said, it's not exhaustive, but what we are reading today are invitations, are doors that are waiting to be opened, and they will lead on to so much that we are missing, there's so much that's absent from our reading this hour. And this is also a dynamic that happens in classrooms and syllabi and anthologies. Yes. And to Ali's boxes, I like your boxes: ancestors, parents, peers, and local. I have a parent, I think, who's also a poet, who I think is in the audience. I try to contend with him in translation and in reading. We haven't selected from him, which is a healthy thing, I think. But it's good to think about your readings and your relationship with the tradition in terms of these boxes. But let's break out of your boxes, Ali, and think of ancestors as also our peers, and to think of the local as the beginning or the first step to the universal. And so the boxes can also be broken down and moved around, and especially since we're going to begin with Tarafa, who is your countryman, like he's your local, but he's also your peer. He's as old as you are forever. He's the 25-year-old or the 20-year-old, but he is also one of the most urgent poets, although pre-Islamic and very distant from us in time, but not in place for you, Ali. But he and his poem are an example of how poetry resists boxes and resists history and will always be urgent. A great poem is a poem that's always present. And I hope we'll read some of these poems today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and we've selected 10 poems. We've got about 45 minutes, so we're going to see how we can go. And I don't know, Martin, if you want to make any comments about how this will work before or we can just jump straight into Tarafa as well.
I think jump in, but I encourage people to use the chat to join in and ask questions, and we will try to bring them in as we go along.
Thank you. And so we'll read, and I think after each one we'll talk a little bit about the particular poem. And as we go along, we'll have more to talk about, because we'll also be able to talk about how they connect to each other, which is the real excitement, I think. So I am going to share the screen. Unfortunately, we weren't able to include the Arabic onto the screen, but we'll be reading in Arabic and sharing the translations along for everyone to read with, for those who need it.
Yeah, so the first poet we selected, and you'll notice that our selections are chronological a little bit, but then they won't be at the end, where we put younger poets first, among the contemporaries, younger poets first and older poets later. But Tarafa ibn al-Abd is one of the authors of the Mu'allaqat, which are 7 hung or hanging odes, or 10, depending on the narrative or the account you adopt. Supposedly he lived in Bahrain or died in Bahrain. He had a very romantic life. And again, sensitivity to selection It's a long poem and we've selected verses from it, which means we've compromised its integrity, its arc, its movement, but that's okay. That's an invitation to you to go and read all of the mu'allaqat tonight. But this is the mu'allaqa of Tarafa. لخولة أطلال ببرقة ثهمدي تلوح كباقي الوشم في ظاهر اليد وقوفا بها صحبي علي مطيهم يقولون لا تهلك أسا وتجلدي كأن حدوج المالكية غدوة خلايا سفين بالنواصف من ددي عدولية أو من سفين ابن يامن يجور بها الملاح طورا ويهتدي يشق حباب الماء حيزومها بها كما قسم الترب المفايل باليد وفي الحي أحوى ينفض المرد شادن مظاهر سمطي لؤلؤ وزبرجد خذول تراعي ربربا بخميلة تناول أطراف البرير والترتدي وتبسم عن ألمى كأن منورا تخلل حر الرمل دعس له ندي سقته إيات الشمس إلا لثاته أسف ولم تكدم عليه بإثمدي ووجه كأن الشمس ألقت رداءها عليه نقي اللون لم يتخدد وإني لأمضي الهم عند احتضاره بعوجاء مرقال تروح وتغتدي على مثلها أمضي إذا قال صاحبي ألا ليتني أفديك منها وأفتدي وجاشت إليه النفس خوفا وخاله مصابا ولو أمسى على غير مرصدي إذا القوم قالوا من فتى خلت أنني عنيت فلم أكسل ولم أتبلد أرى الموت يعتام الكرام ويصطفي عقيلة مال الفاحش المتشدد أرى العيش كنزا ناقصا كل ليلة وما تنقص الأيام والدهر ينفدي لعمرك إن الموت ما أخطأ الفتى لك الطول المرخى وثنياه في اليد.
Wonderful. And I think very well read. And we should also say that you translated this particular translation that we're seeing on the screen as well. And
yes. And I probably should add that this was part of a wonderful project I was part in, funded by Isra and Majallat Qafila in Saudi Arabia, where we translated the 10 mu'allaqat for millennials. So a new translation that's hoping to relate to the present moment. Yes.
And we have a couple of millennials in here, I'm sure. So I think it is reaching its intended audience. And for me, there were two things that drew me to this. And one was the local, because reading the mu'allaqat, for one thing, trying to, as someone trying to grasp a tradition that they don't feel fully part of, having the luck perhaps to have one of the 10 mu'allaqat be by someone, a countryman, immediately creates a connection. So I think very early on, I'm not sure that it was in your lines, very early on, there's a reference to pearls, for example. And I think pearls are mentioned by many poets, but of course, whenever a Khaliji mentions pearls, it's very like, this is where we're from, we're going to mention the pearls. There's also Huduj al-Malkiya, where that is still, a village is named after the Malik tribe today. So for me, this was something that drew me to it. But also, then once you're in, there's a lot of beauty to it. And I deliberately chose to stay on this last stanza that you, 3 stanzas that you've chosen, well, abiyat, they become stanzas in English, which I think simply has the pleasure of almost of a story told, but also of a wisdom that doesn't age.
Yes, and his biography is very interesting. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant because it's very poetic. So Tarafa is a stubborn young man, vain and a bit naive, and he walks towards his death. And the stories say when asked which method of execution he's going to choose, he chooses to drink to death. So go visit his biography. But the poem overall is a poem about it's a very bitter poem. It's a poem about being let down by relatives, by friends who didn't stand up for you. And that's a feeling we all can relate to sometimes. And his observations on life and death and time, أرى العيش كنزا ناقصا كل ليلة. I mean, that is a line that rings so true and so close, even especially in this past very unusual year we all experienced. And that's what I mean when I say that the mu'allaqat are and the ancestors are also our friends and our peers and our companions in experience. And they create, with their poetry, these bridges across history and time. Yes, in my mind, the Tarafa is a very close and urgent voice. And these are some of my favorite lines. And of course, between وَإِنِّي لَأُمْضِي الْهَمَّ and then the ellipsis after that, we skipped over his description of the naqa, which is one of the most iconic and lengthy descriptions of the she-camel. And again, that's a recommendation. He exaggerates in describing his mount. He probably procrastinates or evades from dealing with his feelings by giving us this very, very detailed description, which we skipped here.
I think we can all appreciate that when you've got a job to do and you end up procrastinating and making something that doesn't need to be very perfect.
Walking your dog, yeah, it's a similar thing.
And I was lucky to only just yesterday finally receive his diwan, which was sent to me by family from Bahrain. So I will be enjoying it in much more detail as well. I think what you were saying as well about things speaking through the centuries, I feel that very strongly with the next poem as well. So it's a good segue, which is this one poem I selected was from Majnun Layla, and it's one of the many poems said to have been written by Qasim al-Mulawah, who the story, which most people will be familiar with, I think, is that he was not allowed to marry his cousin. She was married off to a man in Iraq, and they had this kind of noble and pious yearning for each other. They both end up dead. Majnun dies of grief that he could not be with her, but is happy in death that he can be reunited with her. And everyone, I think, in the West loves to point out that this story precedes Romeo and Shakespeare by about 900 years. So the poem that I'm chosen, I'll get right into it then. متى يشتفي منك الفؤاد المعذب وسهم المنايا من وصالك أقرب فبعد ووجد واشتياق ورجفة فلا أنت تدنيني ولا أنا أقرب كعصفورة في كف طفل يزمها تذوق حياض الموت والطفل يلعب فلا الطفل ذو عقل يرق لما بها ولا الطير ذو ريش يطير فيذهب ولي ألف وجه قد عرفت طريقه ولكن بلا قلب إلى أين أذهب. For me, the thing that sticks out is that last line, of course, and reading it in the present, it's difficult not to place, you can place a romantic lens to it. It's difficult not to place a kind of almost let's say nationalist in a way lens to it. It's difficult not to think of your homeland when you're not in your homeland. Where shall I go to my heart if you are, where shall I go to my heart if you are not with me? Speaks to that yearning.
And that's something we're going to see in many of the selections, this conflation of beloved and homeland. We're going to see it with Sayyab. We're going to see, it's a very common theme. And you're exactly right. What stands out to me in this piece is the line, كَعُصْفُورَةٍ فِي كَفِّ طِفْلٍ يَزُمُّهَا. The image of the heart being a bird in a child's hand, and the child is suffocating or squeezing. The squeezing of the heart is something we're all familiar with when we live so far away from our first places and our first languages. And This nostalgia is one way of describing it, but it's so much more. Yes, and of course we've skipped over so many important poets from Tarafa to Majnun, Layla, but this idea of love of a person, but also love of self and homeland are a running theme in our selections and in general.
And I think it also, it's a beautiful metaphor, and it also it crosses time. And I think there were so many that could have been picked from Majnun Layla, and I have that book was actually one of the ones that I put in my curated list, but it was on this one, and I read it first in the Arabic, then in the English, that connected immediately, and I did not need to know or think about the original context to apply it to my own. And I think that is the beauty as well that we see. I think, shall we move on to our next one, which is Al-Mutanabbi, is one of yours.
Yeah, I hope Mutanabbi is one of mine. That's what I aspire to. So Mutanabbi is one of the greatest names in poetry of all time. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. And that's why it's very daunting to translate him. And when Ali now will flip to the following slide, this is a very rough translation of a few lines that open one of his praise poems. And I would like to insist or just underscore this idea that every translation of Mutanabbi is an unfinished translation. He is one of the poets who loses most in translation. And I like to think that that's because of his poetry is so rooted in Arabic's forms of thought. I mean, they are so specifically Arabic that when you take him out of Arabic, he feels like a stranger. And that's why we selected this opening of this poem that begins Maghani al-Shabi Tiban fil Maghani. And this is a poem that Mutanabbi wrote when he was in non-Arabic speaking lands, when he was in Persia, and he felt like an outsider. So the selection speaks to that, the feeling of being in exile, but we also selected it because it contains one of my favorite metaphors or images by Mutanabbi, which is the image of the coins, the light trickling through the branches and casting shiny coins on the ground and on his clothes that escape his grasp. And again, we can say a lot about the translation and how inadequate it is, but I think it's just best to listen to him. Mutanabbi says, مغاني الشعب طيبا في المغاني كمنزلة الربيع من الزمان ولكن الفتى العربي فيها غريب الوجه واليد واللسان ملاعب جنة لو سار فيها سليمان لسار بترجمان طبت فرساننا والخيل حتى خشيت وإن كرمنا من الحران عدونا تنفض الأغصان فيها على أعرافها مثل الجمان فسرت وقد حجبنا الشمس عني وجئنا من الضياء بما كفاني وألقى الشرق منها في ثيابي دنانيرا تفر من البنان. And then the poem goes on into a praise poem. So there's also this need for a translator. Even Solomon walking through this beautiful landscape would have needed a translator. This speaks so directly to my experience in the United States. It reminds me of the time when I was living in Vermont, which is one of the most beautiful places in the US. But the more beautiful the landscape was, the more alienated I felt. لأني كنت غريبة الوجه واليد واللسان.
It's a beautiful metaphor, which is immediately, which is also very rooted in Arab and Islamic, of course, folklore. So I think understanding it, because for me, process of translation is process of understanding, and it's the joy as well of being able to make a connection so far between these, so far in space and time through these commonalities. And what I like as well is that line, which you've translated as, and still this Arab here remains strange of face and hand and tongue. Of course, as you say, every translation is incomplete with Al-Mutanabbi, but it's a very almost surprisingly modern line, even in the original Arabic, I think. And you would think that you could show this line and say that so-and-so wrote this on their departure from Iraq in the 1970s, and you'd believe them. And that's part of the beauty of this.
Well, I have to thank you for that. That's your note on the translation, this Arab. So the original has لكن الفتى العربية, and the word fata means, you know, the brave one, the valiant one, like the fata in Tarafa. But you're exactly right. This fata is you and me. It's us in exile, in immigration, in graduate school, far away from home. This Arab is a very good way to express that.
We're one closer to a perfect translation, one word closer.
It's on the path towards him. But let me say, I promised myself, I have the word Habib here in front of me. I promised myself to say, we skipped from Majnun Layla to Mutanabbi, but we have then missed out on one of the most formative, innovative, revolutionary phases in the Arabic poetic tradition. Mutanabbi is the heir of the early Muhdath poets, the early Abbasids, who include Bashar ibn Burd, Abu Nuwas, and Habib ibn Aus, yani Abu Tammam, one of my favorite poets of all time. So it's important to, yes, we compare Mutanabbi to Shakespeare. Again, that's a comparison that I don't like that much. But he is the product, Mutanabbi is the product of an earlier phase of experimentation and innovation in the Arabic Qasida, and some of its prominent figures are the ones I mentioned, and especially Abu Tammam.
Of course, that's one of your specialties, is that period of Arabic poetry as well, isn't it?
Yes, and I like it very much when you call him modern. So because I work a lot on what I call Abbasid modernism. I and others have called a modernist or modernizing project in the Abbasid age.
And I saw someone asked, what is the name of the poem? So someone put it in, it's called Maghani Sha'bi. But because these older poems particularly, their name would just be the first bait, the first line, and that's how they're known. And because I don't know if you know of any other translation of this poem that someone might be translated, but we translated this one particularly for today. So I think we're going to do something really unfair now, which is jump how many centuries in the future? 1200 years, I think, which is not to imply that nothing happened in that time. And I think something needs to be done to go back and investigate that time, because I don't think anyone really talks about, and I thought about it, at least in the public sphere, no one really talks about that period between the Abbasids and the modern age. Not in the...
many academics do. But
the academics, of course, but if I wanted to find out a book of Mamluk Cairene poetry, I'm not going to find that in any bookshelf, which is a shame. And I think jumping forward so far made me realize that gap in my own knowledge. But we skip over to Nazik al-Malaika and her poem Al-Kolera, which is published in Revolt Against the Sun, this translation, which is out, and a beautiful book. And Nazik was one of these great modernizers as such, wasn't she? And what she did was change, up until the modern time, Arabic poetry relied on meter and rhyme. She changed how she was measuring meter as such, without getting into the technicality. So her basic unit was the foot rather than the full line. And this creates a whole new way of writing poetry, which the claim is that she is one of the starters of it. This poem is one of the earliest, and which people like Mahmoud Darwish kind of take and make their own as well. And a lot of modern poetry we're familiar with is in this form that's called the Taf'ila poem. And this is one of the very first ones. So I have the pleasure of controlling both the slides and reading. So I will try to be good at that. سكن الليل أصغي إلى وقع صدى الأنات في عمق الظلمة تحت الصمت على الأموات صرخات تعلو تضطرب، حزن يتدفق يلتهب، يتعثر فيه صدى الآهات، في كل فؤاد غليان، في الكوخ الساكن أحزان، في كل مكان روح تصرخ في الظلمات، في كل مكان يبكي صوت هذا ما قد مزقه الموت، الموت الموت الموت، يا حزن النيل الصارخ مما فعل الموت. طلع الفجر، أصغي إلى وقع خطى الماشين، في صمت الفجر أصخ انظر ركب الباكين، 10 أموات 20 لا تحصي أصخ للباكين، اسمع صوت الطفل المسكين، موتى موتى ضاع العدد، موتى موتى لم يبقى غد، في كل مكان جسد يندبه محزون، لا لحظة إخلاد لا صمت، هذا ما فعلت كف الموت، الموت الموت الموت، تشكو البشرية تشكو ما يرتكب الموت. الكوليرا في كهف الرعب مع الأشلاء، في صمت الأبد القاسي حيث الموت دواء، استيقظ داء الكوليرا حقدا يتدفق موتورا، هبط الوادي المرح الوضاء، يصرخ مضطربا مجنونا، لا يسمع صوت الباكين، في كل مكان خلف مخلبه الأصداء، في كوخ الفلاحة في البيت لا شيء سوى صرخات الموت، الموت الموت الموت، في شخص الكوليرا القاسي ينتقم الموت. الصمت مرير، لا شيء سوى رجع التكبير، حتى حفار القبر ثوى لم يبق نصير، الجامع مات مؤذنه، الميت من سيؤبنه، لم يبق سوى نوح وزفير، نوح وزفير. الطفل بلا أم وأب يبكي من قلب ملتهب، وغدا لا شك سيلقفه الداء الشرير، يا شبح الهيضة ما أبقيت، لا شيء سوى أحزان الموت، الموت الموت الموت، يا مصر شعور مزقه ما فعل الموت. Okay.
Yes, so as Ali mentioned, yes, Nazik al-Malaika is one of the pioneers of the modernist movement, but it's also necessary to mention other poets, contemporaries of hers, who were pioneers of the movement as well. Adonis is not in our list, but Adonis is easy to find. He's probably one of the more translated poets. And as Ali explained, this is a huge jump. I also have a note here. Yes, there's not much on Mamluk poetry, but we also skipped over a very important period, which is the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, with someone like Ahmad Shawqi, for example, who is probably more well-known than others. Kulthum sang many of his brilliant songs, and this was poetry written in the 20th century, still following classical meter and rhyme, and also addressing urgent contemporary issues like, the British presence in Egypt and other, current issues of the time. I'd also like to acknowledge the effort that Ali is making in reading the Arabic. And you remember, we're talking here about self and identity and exile. And Ali is a young Arab poet who writes in English and in Arabic. And it's important to mention and also celebrate this effort that young people like Ali make to create a relationship with Arabic. It's not easy to think of all the harakat and all the Arab and to read, but that's what real love is. It's a difficult relationship and it's worth making. And I think regardless of what our grammar teachers think, grammar is very important. We cannot have a relationship with Arabic or poetry or ourselves without Arabic grammar. That's what I tell my students who get bored with me going on and on about grammar rules. But it's also important to acknowledge a poetic practice among young people who have Ali's experience, people who are so invested in a relationship with this language, but it's more effortful for them because they are in Manchester, in Philadelphia, in New York. And I think what they're writing is just as important and urgent as every other text we're reading on this list today.
And I think that was part of the pleasure of doing this, and thank you for that, because I have just turned 30, so I am still young, but I don't get to tick myself as young on forums anymore. But when I was 20, I basically had zero Arabic, and I realized, and that was despite living in Bahrain for 7 years, by the time of 18, I was worse than when I was 8 in my own language. And so it took a long time to get here. So I want to also say that, because someone said, I wish my Arabic was as good. And I look at everybody around me and I think, I wish my Arabic was as good. So that was also part of doing this, is actually hoping that there are young Arabs who, to say that, you know, it is a process. It doesn't ever end. I couldn't, if you had told me, you know, this time next year, you'll be reading Arabic to an audience and not be shaking completely, I wouldn't have believed you. So that's a very important part of this relationship with our mother tongues. And I think you're absolutely right. We did miss a bunch, and Ahmed Shawki would have been very good to put, because of course many of his poetry was put to Kulthum's music in particular. So that's a thought for next time, maybe. What, of course, I chose this poem, what made it very easy to choose this is because you read it and you are in the present moment. You do not need to know that Egypt suffered an outbreak of cholera. And yet also, what is beautiful about Nazik's work is that she does make you see Egypt so vividly. And you are in Egypt when you read this. When I read this, I'm not in Manchester reflecting on the pandemic. I do that after I read this poem, which is different from my experience with the previous poem where I mentioned Majnun Layla, where I saw immediately applying it. This one was a more reflective practice. Yeah, Jory, this is a shame-free zone. So we'll move on to the next one, I think, shall we? Which is actually Nazik's contemporary and other very famous modernizer of poetry.
Yeah, so our next selection is again a selection from a longer poem. So we have tampered with this poem, but have selected, because it's relatively longer, some of our favorite sections. This is probably one of the most translated poems from modern Arabic poetry. The translation we have is done by Lina Jayusi and Christopher Middleton, and it's from Everyman's Arabic Poems, but it's also included in Modern Arabic Poetry, an anthology edited by Salma Khadr al-Jayusi, who's another very important scholar. If you want to learn more, she's written a lot on modern Arabic poetry. Movements and Trends is one of her most important books. أنشودة المطر, the Song of Rain. عيناك غابتا نخيل ساعة السحر، أو شرفتان راح ينأى عنهما القمر. عيناك حين تبسمان تورق الكروم، وترقص الأضواء كالأقمار في نهر، يرجه المجذاف وهنا ساعة السحر، كأنما تنبض في غوريهما النجوم. وتغرقان في ضباب من أسى شفيف، كالبحر سرح اليدين فوقه المساء، دفء الشتاء فيه وارتعاشة الخريف، والموت والميلاد والظلام والضياء، فتستفيق ملء روحي رعشة البكاء، ونشوة وحشية تعانق السماء، كنشوة الطفل إذا خاف من القمر. أتعلمين أي حزن يبعث المطر؟ وكيف تنشج المزاريب إذا انهمر؟ وكيف يشعر الوحيد فيه بالضياع، بلا انتهاء كالدم المراق كالجياع كالحب كالأطفال كالموتى، هو المطر. ومقلتاك بي تطيفان مع المطر، وعبر أمواج الخليج تمسح البروق، سواحل العراق بالنجوم والمحار، كأنها تهم بالشروق فيسحب الليل عليها من دم دثار. أصيح بالخليج يا خليج يا واهب اللؤلؤ والمحار والردى فيرجع الصدى كأنه النشيج يا خليج يا واهب المحار والردى. وكم ذرفنا ليلة الرحيل من دموع ثم اعتللنا خوف أن نلام بالمطر. مطر مطر. ومنذ أن كنا صغاراً كانت السماء تغيم في الشتاء ويهطل المطر. وكل عام حين يعشب الثرى نجوع. ما مر عام والعراق ليس فيه جوع. مطر مطر مطر.
Thank you. And what's a wonderful reading as well, especially فيرجع الصدى كأنه النشيج. And I think you read it as an echo. And this poem, as a translator and as like someone starting out in translation and not knowing what I was doing 2 years ago, when I read Lina Jayusi's version, I read it and I thought, I cannot imagine a different translation. This is this poem in English, and particularly Drip Drop the Rain, which I'm going to come to, because then when I mentioned this, you pointed out to me as well that it's a very deliberate allusion to one of Badr al-Sayyab's own influences, major influences, through translation of English into Arabic poetry, which is T.S. Eliot, isn't it? And The Wasteland. And there are also, I think the fact that you have, just in something I enjoy in the translation, that it's drip drop the rain rather than matar. It could easily be the rain. And this actually, I think, creates a more closer sound in English to what it is in Arabic. But you also have the references to the Gulf and this echo where the wealth disappears in the echo and you are left only with the death, the giver of shells and death. And so there's this beautiful opening, and then it gradually transforms into this unquestionably political thing. And I guess the one thing we should mention for this and for several of our poems is that these are excerpts. These aren't the full poems. Otherwise, we would definitely be here till sunrise.
Yes, somebody in the chat mentions that it has been made into a song by Rima Banna. It's also been made into a song by Muhammad Abdu, the amazing. So this is one of the iconic poems of modern Arabic poetry, and it also opens again with that theme of the beloved that turns into the homeland we lament. So عيناك غابتان خيل, and then we end with ما مر عام والعراق ليس فيه جوع. It's again, that's a running thread in our selections, but it's again, it also speaks to the experience of exile and immigration. Yes. So, but there are many other names we can mention around Nazik al-Malaika and Badr Shakir al-Sayyab who are missing, and this again is an invitation to read around them.
Certainly. And I think one of the connections is going to come right up next, in fact, with our next poem, which in fact references this phrase of ما مر عام والخليج, but I've forgotten it as I'm saying it.
So it's والعراق here, but it will become والخليج in your next.
That's
reading.
why I've confused it. And I'm just before I do, I think I might just I'll continue ahead. So this is Qasim Haddad, who is a Bahraini poet, and who I think won the Cairo Prize last year, if I remember the name of the prize right, but has been writing since 1970 until the present. And this is from his second diwan. And Qasim is a Bahraini poet from Muharraq, coming from a leftist, I think, political history, yet also in one of his early political diwans, using the kind of the story of the murder of, or the martyrdom of Hussein, Imam Hussein for Shia, to tell a political, to reflect on today's politics, and also doing things around the metaphors, the kind of not the metaphors, but the challenging, I suppose, and channeling godhood into poetry in different ways. And that's something that Adonis and others also do, isn't it? So this next one is called خروج رأس الحسين من المدن الخائنة. لو ترك القطا لنام صاحب الرأس نسير بلا حيرة كانت الحيرة مثل القناديل في جلدنا نسير على أرض كل الشوارع أقدامنا رعد كل الزوابع يتبعنا الحزن والياسمين ونستصرخ الموت والموت يصرخ فينا تجيئون برقا نجيء من المدن الخائنة مدينتنا لم تخن نحن خنا وحين تداخلت الصور المرعبة صرخنا وجئنا نسن حراب الفجيعة نشرب خمر التغرب نصنع من حجر الموت كأسا وأنخابنا من بروق المحبة والحقد والاعتراف على أرض كل الشوارع في مدن الثورة النائمة زحفنا ولما فتحنا كتاب السماء ولما عرفنا الدماء توقف نبض الحديد وجاءت لنا الساعة القائمة نسير بلا حيرة كانت الحيرة مثل الوسام على بطن كل الضفادع في المدن الخائنة نسير ندحرج تاريخنا ونركله باحترام ولم نأخذ الأرض بالسيف كنا قتاة وكانت محابرنا من دماء وكان الذي فوقنا يبول علينا ونحن نقول اسقنا ونشرب نسكر حتى تمر الليالي علينا وحتى تصدقوا أن السكوت كلام نسير ونعرف كيف نشق التراب ونبذر داخله الكائنات وكيف نحز الرؤوس ونزرعها عبر كل العصور فنحن الحسين المسافر من كربلاء ورأس الحسين الممزق بين دمشق وبين الخليج ونحمله نستريح على سورة المومياء ما مر عام والخليج ليس فيه جوع ويستقبل الجوع رأس الحسين ويفتح باب الحريق ليدخل رأس الحسين تصير البلاد عروسا لها 1000 طفل و1000 عشيق نسير معا تلد العاقرات الأغاني نسير ونحن جميع اللغات الغريبة ونحن الحبيب الذي عرف الدرب نحو الحبيبة نسير انتظرنا طويلا تأخر موعدنا فقتلنا وقمنا من القبر ثانية وقتلنا وقمنا ولكننا ما هزمنا وسرنا مع الرأس سرنا إلى كل أرض وكل حياة نسير بلا حيرة. That is unfortunately not the end of the poem. It continues on. And the one thing I'll say about translating it is often there's a lot of wasirna, waqumna. And normally you actually remove the word, the and in translation. But I think what Qasim was doing is creating a sense of confusion through the insistence of a lack of confusion. And for me, I associated strongly with that because, thinking about diaspora again, a lot of your confusion with your identity, you pin to migration and you blame migration. It is easy, I should say, I'm not claiming everyone, but it's easy to blame migration for a reason why you do not understand things. So it is pleasurable for me to read a poem in Arabic, which dwells and sits in confusion. And I don't think it ever rises out of confusion. I think it begins and it ends in confusion. And for me, I actually find that quite moving and quite, I don't know, somehow it comforts me in a way.
Yeah, speaking of confusion in the aftermath of a great calamity, so it doesn't have to be separation or immigration or exile, but a huge event like the death of Hussein here leaves us disoriented for all of time. This will come up in our last selection, Syria, from Salim Barakat, so, and how this confusion spills into sound and thought and language. Yeah, so Qasim Haddad is another modern Arab poet who writes in Arabic, and around him again, the academic in me keeps wanting to fill in the gaps, and that's impossible. But as Ali mentioned, this is one of his earlier works, and it's a poem in free verse, so there is meter here, although Qasim Haddad will then go on to become one of the more prominent prose poets in Arabic. Between Qasim Haddad and our next reading from Mahmoud Darwish, there are again many names, and let me here return to the box of parents, so Jawdat Fakhreddine and some of his contemporaries in Lebanon, Azaizeh, Muhammad Ali Shamsuddin. In Egypt, a great figure like Ahmed Abd al-Mu'ti Hijazi, so other free verse poets, Egyptian, who participated in this movement, which we tend to locate in Beirut and Baghdad, but it also has extensions elsewhere. Mohammed Ben Nis in Morocco, and many, many others whom we're failing to miss and we're leaving out.
And I think I'll just add before the next one as well, and you're absolutely right. One thing that's funny about Qasim Haddad is he is very prolific, and yet I think poorly translated in English. There's relatively little considering the wealth of works that he's produced. He's more translated in German, I'm aware. So Martin and other German speakers are lucky in that regard. And the other interesting thing there is actually, we could have chosen 5 or so poems, because when we were choosing like what poem speaks to others, what poet speaks with another from this curated list, Qasim kept coming up. Well, he does speak with these modern poets. He does speak with the free verse poets. He speaks with Tarafa. He's got an entire diwan named after Tarafa, and in conversation with him. He's got an entire diwan named after Majnun Layla, and is in conversation with him. This one is in conversation with Badr al-Sayyab in a certain extent. So this is a way to say, maybe the translators amongst us, there's a wealth here to translate, and those Arabic and German readers amongst us, there's a wealth to read.
Mm-hmm. So our next poem is from none other than Mahmoud Darwish. This is a poem from his later works. It comes from the collection لا تعتذر عما فعلت. And this is one of my favorite poems because it's Darwish turning to his craft and moving away from themes he's often associated with, such as Palestine, but still Palestine can be read into this poem. This poem is about an event and people interpreting it differently. The breaking of the cypress tree. The translation is by Fadi Juda. And Salim Barakat, I'm getting ahead of myself. Mahmoud Darwish begins this poem with a quotation from Bassam Hajjar, allowing us here to say a few words about Bassam Hajjar. Is a brilliant, less known in translation poet. He's a prose poet, so he will allow us to mention again a few names: Abbas Baidoun from Lebanon, Wadia Saadi also from Lebanon, Qasim Haddad, as we mentioned, Sargun Boulos, and many other prose poets, and that's like a parallel line to the free verse project in Arabic, and it has consequences in contemporary and younger poets' work as well. So the quotation from Bassam Hajjar, if we go to it, says, and here again, Mahmoud Darwish is in conversation with Hajjar and writes a poem in response to these few lines. Hajjar says, الثروة شجن الشجرة وليس الشجرة ولا ظل لها لأنها ظل الشجرة. Darwish says, الثروة انكسرت كمئذنة ونامت في الطريق على تقشف ظلها خضراء داكنة كما هي لم يصب أحد بسوء مرت العربات مسرعة على أغصانها هب الغبار على الزجاج الثروة انكسرت ولكن الحمامة لم تغير عشها العلنية في دار مجاورة وحلق طائران مهاجران على كفاف مكانها وتبادلا بعض الرموز وقالت امرأة لجارتها ترى شاهدت عاصفة فقالت لا ولا جرافة والثروة انكسرت وقال العابرون على الحطام لعلها سئمت من الإهمال أو هرمت من الأيام فهي طويلة كزرافة وقليلة المعنى كمكنسة الغبار ولا تظلل عاشقين وقال طفل كنت أرسمها بلا خطأ فإن قوامها سهل وقالت طفلة إن السماء اليوم ناقصة لأن الثروة انكسرت وقال فتى ولكن السماء اليوم كاملة لأن الثروة انكسرت وقلت أنا لنفسي لا غموض ولا وضوح الثروة انكسرت وهذا كل ما في الأمر إن الثروة انكسرت.
A wonderful reading. And I think one of the wonderful things that it only came to me now, and it came out of this conversation really as you're reading it, is, as you said, he was breaking away from, in a way, from being the poet of Palestine. And he famously, there's some lines of his saying he wants to be remembered for his love poetry, which I imagine you might be able to quote it better than I. And you can read Palestine into it, and you also cannot, if you lack the context of Palestine, you will not see Palestine. And what I found interesting for that is going back to that Majnun Layla poem that I read. As I said, like I read it and I put myself in it, I put my own context, and I saw Bahrain, and I saw that I was I the child or was I the bird? I wasn't sure in that metaphor, but I saw myself fully in it. And I wonder, and I experienced it in a way that someone more familiar with Majnun Layla perhaps may not have. And I wonder, in another 1,000 years, someone reading Mahmoud Darwish, not knowing his context, how they might interpret that poem and what they might take away. There's no answer to that question, perhaps, but it's very interesting how, I think, beautifully written it is. I think you can also, I think I'll actually pause there and give it to you.
There's no one answer, but there are so many answers. And one immediate answer that comes to my mind is poetry. This is a poem about poetry. So Sarwa is also the poem and how you read it and interpret it and frame it, and what you get out of it. And all the different readers are presenting their different readings. It could also still be Palestine and the breaking, al-inkisar, and what do we do in its aftermath? How do we react to it? You have all these different reactions, and it could be anything in life, really, reactions and perspectives. And that's why it's a great poem, because it's open onto all of these possibilities. And after Qasim Haddad, and in response to Bassam Hajjar, it's also worth noting that Darwish's later works are also, they come very, very close to prose without really being prose. They're all in meter, so he keeps meter here, but the poem flows, it's a narrative, there's dialogue, so he really sheds a lot of the lyricism and the high rhetoric that might have characterized some of his earlier works. And to his credit, Mahmoud Darwish is probably one of the poets who challenged themselves most until the very end. And he kept pushing himself out of his comfort zone, to his credit, I think.
And one of the things, I mentioned at the start that I didn't come from an academic background, and actually your own work is some of the stuff which influenced me. Your most recent book, which I have on my shelf, the Arabic prose poem, kind of discusses the course of the prose poem. So we haven't talked about it, but there is a kind of a easy divergence that can be painted between this metered but unrhymed, you might say, poetry that Nazik al-Malaika, Badr Shakir, that Qasim Haddad poem that we read, and this Darwish poem are all written in. And then there is the prose poetry, and actually the next poems are all, the remaining poems are all prose poems. And Adonis was one of the great early prose poets. And there is a divergence between the two forms without getting too much into it. And what's really interesting, which I only know because I read your book to the end and I can prove it, is that it actually ends on Mahmoud Darwish near as much. And well, no, he's the second to last. He comes in towards the end and actually becomes a metered poet, a taf'ila poet in conversation and in honest and unrestricted conversation with the prose poem, and which leads us to, we always ask, what is poetry? And I think it almost comes to a conclusion is that poetry is what, if you think it is a poem, it is a poem almost, I think is a standpoint that Darwish perhaps was approaching, or certainly was something that I took away from reading all of this.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, he is, as you said, he comes as close as possible without making the leap into prose. And his sincere, unfiltered conversations with the form theoretically is translated into actual conversations. And one of these conversations is with Salim Barakat, where there is talk between them, but there are also poems dedicated to each other, where Salim writes to a poem about Mahmoud Darwish, and Mahmoud Darwish dedicates a poem to Salim Barakat. So again, this speaking and conversing with fellow poets, but also this criticism, this literary criticism or theorizing that takes place inside the poetic text, as poets think about where they stand in a tradition, what are their contributions, what purpose does their craft serve, what is poetry? They keep asking themselves. Yes.
And asking us in turn as well. And I think we'll move on to our next one. So we've got 3 poems left. We've overrun. So I think Martin has said that we'll kind of keep going, but I'm also conscious of everyone's time and still want to respect everyone's time. We have 3 left. They are shorter, I think. I don't want to rush through because the next 2 poets are women, and I'm conscious that we've had mostly men, apart from, I think, Nazik. So I wouldn't want to then say, oh, we need to get to the end, so we'll just brush past Iman, Mersal, and Asmaa Azaizeh, who's coming after this one. So when I put Iman Mersal in the list, it was actually a kind of wish list reading, where I've read a few of her poems in Arabian translation, but I haven't read enough of her, and what I've read has engrossed me. And going to a recent talk by her where she said that all the best literature currently being written in Arabic is by women, and made me take notice as well. If she's saying this and I like her work, I need to be paying a lot more attention. So I was happy. One of the things with the event was it kind of forced me to actually, gave me the opportunity, I should say, to engage more with her work. And this is a poem. The translation is by Huda, I think, and the poem is from An Alternate Geography 2000, published in 2006. It's called Dr. Levy. Dr. Levy يقول لي إنه لا ينسى المرضى الذين يتعذبون بلغات مختلفة. أقول له إن علاجه لا يحترم وجودا منشطرا في 2، وأنه لم يجرب جحيم أن يتفرج على نفسه من قوة في جدار ذاته. لو كان دكتور ليفي مصريا لأصبح نجما في السينما. لو كنت ما زلت مصرية لوقعت في غرامه. لكنه هاجر من روسيا لأسباب اقتصادية، ومن إسرائيل لأسباب أخلاقية، ومن جنوب أفريقيا لأسباب عاطفية، ويبدو أنه يتعذب بلغات مختلفة.
I think we can all relate to that. Yes, we can all relate to that, suffering in different languages. And I have to mention Iman's most recent book, award-winning في أثر عنايات الزيات, which proves her versatility when it comes to, experimenting in different forms. And this is a book that's memoir / poetry. There's always poetry / novels / detective work. And she is that second generation of prose poets, if we are to divide them boringly into generations. She is part of a group, and to mention others around her, contemporaries of her, especially Egyptians. Imad Abu Saleh would be another lesser known poet who's very important, I think, and untranslated and very hard to access his works and get hold of them. I think it's deliberate on his part. But there is a very interesting and experimental work being done by this generation of prose poets.
That's amazing. I think, conscious of time, I think I'll move on to the next one, but we'll be able to talk about how some of these, we will see some similarities, I think, where this is written almost as, well, it is written as 2 paragraphs and translated into 2 paragraphs. And so it breaks from that metered, is a break from the meter that we've been seeing. And I think it's self-explanatory, I think, perhaps, of in a very beautiful way, that of finding connection where one does not expect to find connection.
Mm-hmm.
So our next poem is Asmaa Azaizeh Ashya Na'ima. And I put Asmaa down in the curated list. Asmaa has also been better translated in German than in English. So the German speakers can find her there. And this poem, I first saw it on her socials I think at the New Year, and fell in love with it because, again, I think it's a poem where if you want to, and I think you are tempted to whenever a Palestine writes, to read Palestine into it. And you can read Palestine into this poem, and you can also read it for what it is, you know, without adding political metaphors. And I find that very interesting because I find I read something new into this every time. So without further ado, Ashya Na'ima. And I should mention that Asmaa's name literally is the plural of names, which comes up in the Ism Asmaa. So it comes up in the poem. She references the meaning of her name. انظري إلي يا أمي فقد عدت بمزيد من اللحم والعظام والحكمة. صرت أفكر بالموت وأنام دون هدهدة، وأسنان اللبن صارت تطحن الخسارات طحنا. عدت فوجدت ألسنة التهاليل بتراء، أطفال يجعرون من كل زاوية، صوت المؤذن مكتوما بيد غريبة. العودة شاشة سينما، وأنا لم أعد أميز تلك البطلة. دخلت مرة وعبثت بالسيناريو آلاف المرات. العودة قطة أكلت صغارها. العودة ضفيرتي التي قصصتها ورميتها في أفواه الزمن. صارت الحاكورة الخضراء امرأة تخاف الهرم، والبئر صارت سريرا في مشفى، والقطة أرواح النساء اللاتي شهقن فوق زندي. وصرت أمك، أغطي جسدك بجسدي من رصاصة الغفلة التي ستفلت من سنينك 70. اللكنة التي ركبتها ناخت تحت التراب. أين رحلت القاف المشاءة؟ وأين الكاف التي لم تبرح العتبة؟ أين المقلاع والعصفور وابن الجيران؟ ماذا كان اسمه؟ وماذا كان اسمي؟ لو كان لاسمي اسم واحد كنت لأنساه، كان سيسقط فوق رأسي مباشرة كرمية قناس محترف. أين الجواعد التي يبستها بملح الحياة؟ أين مونة الحرب التي لم تأتي فأكلها الانتظار والسوس؟ أين الباب الشمالي المفتوح على الفرح؟ أين عمي محمود الذي أكل العشب واستغفر الله ذنب البشرية؟ أبي العجوز الذي صار ابني مات، لكن أين أبي الشاب الذي كان أبي؟ أين الجسد الذي كنت أتسلقه وأقطف من جبينه ثمار التاريخ الحامضة؟ قولي له تعفنت دروس السياسة في رأسي واستبدلتها بقصائد لا أفهمها، قصدت تكحيلها فأعميتها، رفعت أمي سبابتها فوق شفتيها أومأت لي بأن أخرس، وأشارت إلى أكوام من الأشياء النائمة. I think one of the things I love about that is actually right at the end. تعفنت دروس السياسة في رأسي واستبدلتها بقصائد لا أفهمها. The study of politics has rotted in my head and I've replaced it with poems I do not understand, which I feel speaks to the draw for something like this. I think it speaks to the experience we have of going and studying abroad, studying in the West, and finding it does not mesh with what we want it to. It doesn't connect in the way we expect it to. And there's so many things I could talk about. I think I'll pause there.
Yes, and in the interest of time, I think it's time to end with our last selection.
Which is Salim Barakat.
So again, if we are to place him chronologically, we'd put him with the generation of Qasim, Haddad, and younger than the two we've read. And the selection is from his book-length poem, Syria. So again, we're doing a lot of violence here by selecting from a book-long poem 2 sections. And we've selected the very opening of the poem and the very end. And this is a poem he wrote after the events, the disaster in Syria. It's a poem lamenting Syria, but also it's a poem that's angry at Syria, at the country. And it's a relationship some of us might relate to. These are homelands that we spend all of our lives lamenting, but also we are bitter towards them because we have to lament them. They are a heavy burden that we carry. We love them and hate them at the same time. And yeah, one can say a lot about that. But you'll notice when I read the Arabic that it's not easy to read Salim Barakat. His language definitely produces confusion, to go back to the confusion in the aftermath of great calamity. And I think Barakat, if I am to assume, deliberately tries to create events of confusion in language. And he is really known for being a difficult poet, deliberately archaic sometimes in his choice of words and his use of grammar. So he really intimidates you with grammar and with diction. He puts you in your place and he dumbfounds you, and it's an experience. In my mind, this poem is angry. There's rage, that's the tone, it's a loud poem. And I'll read the very opening and the very ending. لا تسألوني الضبط متقنا كالربط متقنا بعد الآن. الأعالي مخبلة مزقت صدرتها والأسافل مخبلة كالأنحاء الخبل لا ترتجى بعد الآن. ركبتاي خارتا والسماء خارت، السماء يصلحها الغزاة، السماء العطل، السماء الوزرة بالدم عليها من شلشله، السماء شدو الجنون البلبل ورقص البلبل فوق ذيل التنين، السماء الركل من معتقد إلى معتقد لا دليل على السماء بعده، لا دليل على سلم إليها أو نزول منها بسلم إلى الإنسان أيها البلد. فتق في الروح ورتق، ويل الرجم بعظام الأسلاف الماء والأسلاف الطين، ويل الرجم بالمراقد جوفا خدعت لم تشغلها جثث، ويل البلد أيها البلد، ويل البلد أيها البلد الأكياس، يجمع المخذول فيها ثيابه وعناده وحناجر أولاده المنتزعة، مزاد الشرع عليك، مزاد اليقين فيك، مزاد المزارات السطو والمدافن السطو، أيها البلد، أيها البلد، مسح في الأملاك، بقايا قصر وغزاة غزاة حرس. ألا لا أسألن الضبط كالربط متقنا بعد الآن. ألا لن تعيدني جدتي الغابة إلى ما كنته بعد الآن. لن يعيدني جدي الجبل إلى ما كنته بعد الآن. لن يعيدني إخوتي الطرق الضيقة إلى ما كنته بعد الآن. لن تعيدني شقيقات الصخور ثقيلة في مجاري الأنهار إلى ما كنته بعد الآن. يا لك إرثاً، يا لك إرثاً من نعم المشكلة أيها البلد بلدي، أنت أيها البلد.
It's a wonderful reading. Would you like to give a few comments?
Well, it's silly to comment after this. بعد الآن, بعد هذا. Well, but I can say something very practical. I mean, this is a selection from a forthcoming volume of selected translations from Salim Barakat's work. This will astonishingly be the first volume of English translation of Salim Barakat's work. It's a translation I worked on with Jason Iwan, and it's forthcoming from Seagull Press. And the title of the selection is Come Take a Gentle Stab, which is very fitting because you see there's this rage and this violence in his very use of diction and grammar, his tone, his mood. And it's okay if you're an Arabic speaker and you didn't understand what he was trying to say. I think that's the point of most of what he writes, or at least I say that to comfort myself. There's a state that he tries to conjure up and to insert in the language where comprehension is not the point. He delays comprehension, but as he does that, he makes you feel so many things. And
Master
again,
confounder.
Yes, it's also worth mentioning that he's a very prolific writer and is a novelist as well. But to relate it to other things we've read so far, I mean, like خروج رأس الحسين من المدن الخائنة, or even Tarafa, this idea that when disaster falls or happens, and what do you do بعد الآن? How do you go on from after this? Whether this is being stabbed in the back by relatives, or the martyrdom of Hussein, or the loss of a homeland that you never really reconciled with, but here you are still lamenting it, as we see him do in this piece.
There's a great beauty to it, and you brought out a lot of the emotion in your reading. I've placed the link to the forthcoming book as well, which I think comes out in about a week. One of the things which I think I should say everyone should go and buy, because this one excerpt should convince you that it's worth having. The one thing, which was why we wanted to end on this, and I was very sure of wanting to end on Salim Barakat, was because he is a Kurd writing in Arabic, trying to break Arabic. So we've talked about identity, and we've talked about these poems which draw us back to our homelands and which speak to our souls. Yeah, how do we actually interact with English? We have a love-hate relationship where we use it because we must. We use it because it was imposed on us. If we were born here, it's imposed on us whether or not we're born in the West. And those of us who write poetry and prose in English are constantly thinking, should I be writing this in this language when, the soul of what I have to say is in another language? And I think we forget in a way that, also Arabic is a colonial language. It is a colonial language on the Kurds. And here we have a Kurd whose relationship to Arabic is this very similar, I should never say the same, very similar to the relationship we of migrant backgrounds have with English. And so it turns this whole idea in its own way. And perhaps there's also home to be found in English in a way for those of us who struggle with the fact that we communicate in English. And so this was, for me, very important that we end on Salim, who I think...
Yeah, I think that's what you meant, Ali, when you said any comment. I forget that Salim is not an Arab, because he really poses very urgently the question of what does it mean to be an Arab, right? And his answer that is so very convincing, it's when you can master the language the way he does. This is claiming Arabic, reclaiming it, owning it, conquering it, breaking it, whatever verb you need to do. But ultimately, homeland and self are things that you can build or erect inside a relationship with language and grammar, I have to say. But so it's a rewriting of what it means to belong and what homeland is. Exactly, and that's why translating him is very difficult, because there's so much that happens in the way he strings a sentence together. There's so many layers of contention, of back and forth, of conversation. Yes, and he, exactly right, again to what you said, he proves that we can, and we have to, and we must conquer English and claim it as our own. All of us who have to live with it, whether we like it or not, have to think with it every day and have to navigate ourselves in it and outside of it. And that's why here is where I also make a statement that means so much to me, that what we call Arab American poetic practice, or whatever little category or niche we allow for others who write in English, that has to move to the margin of what we call a poetic practice in English. Because our experiences are just as valid. They're sometimes much more pronounced and excruciating and urgent. And we can add then to this curation, Ya Ali, we've chosen from Tarafa to Asmaa, Azaizeh, we can add to it the many, many poets who are of Arab descent or have an Arab connection or Arabic connection and write in English and French. Those have to be included in the Arabic canon and also in the canons of the language they write, and their work is so necessary.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. And I think to add to that, there's a growing trend amongst many of us where, and Zaina Hashim Beck is a great example of someone who's been writing in English for years. Recently, relatively recently, a year or two or three ago, published a poem in both English and Arabic. And very recently published what she calls her first Arabic poems in an Arabic publication. And this process of maneuvering between the two languages is something I think we're seeing a lot of, and where people go, perhaps swing from one end of to the other.
Yeah, it's nice that you've mentioned Zena as a dear friend, and you're right, this is a very interesting experience from English to Arabic. And since we're very open about our biases, I'd like to also mention here another experience of someone writing in Arabic and then ultimately falling into writing in English out of necessity, out of circumstance. Ahmed al-Mallah, who's Palestinian and writes in English, and his book is titled Bitter English. So very similar, on the same note as Salim Barakat's bitterness in relationship to Arabic. And I have to also say that he's my partner, so this is self-serving here. But so Ahmed's work as well, it contends with language and laments loss of language and the being stuck with English, and then making the best of it into poetry. There's a long list of young poets who also struggle.
I think we should, on that note, start drawing it to a close. So I want to thank everyone as well for staying. I think the vast majority of you staying so long after we ran so cataclysmically over a room full of Arabs. It's bound to happen. We thought to make the cheap jokes, we thought the Arab lateness and the German on-timeness would balance out, and clearly it didn't. So I'm gonna, on that note, pass over to Martin, who is probably shaking his head that I've said that.
I was laughing. Hello, can you hear me? I can't.
Just fine.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I'm gonna keep it really short. And in fact, one thing I wanted to try and do, if I can, is after I spoke, I'm going to speak for under a minute now, very quickly, and then I'm going to try and allow you all to unmute to do a round of applause so we can wrap it up. And after you've left, Huda and Al, if you could just stay on for a minute after everyone's left, that would be nice. I just wanted to say what an incredible event this was. It's provoked reams and reams of notes and thinking and feelings. Ali mentioned, I have my own bilingual kind of inheritance and struggles with language, and Huda's comments that real love is a difficult relationship sparked a lot of thinking about love and language, and my returned phrase that people forget that language can be painful too, which is something I sometimes people need reminding of. I was thinking about what connect the people who've done this curation for us so far. I'm probably going to say this slowly and badly because I'm not great at thinking on my feet, but the rough notes were something that I realized that all the people I've worked with so far have all been on a particular kind of journey. And I was thinking what kind of gives someone authority or expertise to do these things. And Ali was saying earlier that I said to him, make it personal. It should be, the personal will make it an invitation to others. And you've all clearly in the chat I've seen taken that invitation up. And that carries on to expertise. And I think the thing is, if you yourself are on this journey, is that you can take other people with you, and in a long way, and just in the way that you both have done this evening. And for that, I want to thank you really from the bottom of my heart. And I'm going to allow participants to unmute themselves now, and let's see if this works. Otherwise, it's just me clapping, but maybe people can take the mics off. Otherwise, you'll just have to do my round of applause. Oh no, I can hear some more. That's good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It really has been incredible. And testimony